Hello and welcome to this webinar on discovering the power of smart vectors in Nuke. My name is Chris Wetherly and I'm a product specialist at Foundry. Today we're going to be taking a look at some base use cases of smart vectors and then moving on to some production examples of smart vectors and how they can really help you solve problems in your shots. In doing so, we're going to go through the general guidelines, some tips and tricks, and also some common workflow issues that can crop up and how you can work around them. So with that being said, let's dive into what smart vectors are. The Smart Vector toolset is a set of nodes that take advantage of Nuke's advanced vector technology. It includes the Smart Vector node that lets you create high quality motion vectors of your shot. These vectors can then be used with other nodes in the toolset, such as the Vector Distort node, which will push or warp clean patches or textures through a sequence of frames without the need to retract different areas, as it's purely based on the pixel information of your shot. So now let's have a look at what smart vectors are commonly used for. So some of the workflows you might expect to see are adding elements to moving soft surface objects such as clothing and skin. This is particularly good on moving folds and wrinkles in clothing or the muscle deformations you can find across the body. A more experimental technique is adding digital tracker markers to hard to track shots, and that's something we'll dive into later. Smart vectors are also commonly used for driving cleanups or retouching or beauty work. We've even been seeing users creating more and more effects based on the motion vectors of a shot. Smart vectors, like most tools, are appropriate for certain situations, but the great thing is if you're unsure whether they'll be applicable or not, it's really quick and simple to get in, generate some smart vectors, and see how well the vectors are deforming the elements you wish to add in. So let's take a look at some smart vectors in production. More and more users are using smart vectors to help solve problems faster and more efficiently, and often on the latest blockbusters. Here's just a small sample of some of the films that smart vectors have been used in, but they've been used in multiple instances across all production types. Smart vectors on Logan were used for the cuts and scars, in It for an effect on a child's face, and on Life for the cloth rebuilding. We even have a short film called Echo, which was directed by Victor Perez, where smart vectors was used to generate lots of the blood effects and movement around. We'll actually dive into that later and give you a real hands-on approach to a production example. I also wanted to highlight some quotes from some of our friends at Image Engine who worked with smart vectors on the film of Logan. They mentioned how it saved them an incredible amount of time and resources in production, allowed them to work on dozens of tricky shots without having to rely extensively on match move geometry or camera tracking. It even allowed their matte painting team to be able to pick up shots which would normally go to the effects department. They could easily get to work on them because the effects didn't require camera, as everything is frame related. There was no need for distortions, cameras or match moves, so it was really easy and quick to get up and running. So now I'm going to jump across to a basic smart vector use case example and walk you through how to set up smart vectors and generate them really quickly and easily. So with that being said, I'm just going to switch across to my sequence timeline and we're going to work on this short here, which is a nice clip of a girl just moving and talking. It's very simple, there's not a lot of motion, but there is a lot of subtle deformations around the cheeks, and that's where we're going to add our element. The element we'll be adding is this really nice cybernetic scar that we're going to add on the side at our director's request. If I play through, you can see it moves really nicely with the deformations of the cheek. So let's have a look at the script itself and open it up. Here we have our script showcasing it. I just want to highlight that you don't really need to worry about this section. This is just literally the creation of the scar effect itself. So what do we need to do to get up and running with smart vectors? Well, to begin with, we simply need to read in our footage as we have here. And then if we come down, we just come to our smart vector node. Now here we have a few options. The first is the range, where we set the frame range we want to render for our smart vectors, and then the vector detail. I currently have mine set to 1, but the default is 0.3, which is usually perfectly fine for generating vectors to use on your shots. 1 will give you the highest vector detail though, so you'll get the best quality vectors. This does take longer to render, however, so you might want to stick with 0.3 when you're testing out, before then jumping up the detail to 1 later. You then click the render once you've determined your file path. Now by default it'll be set to having this editable, and then you can click render, or in my script I've chosen to output to a write node, which is created here. In doing so, I'm able to use the write node to render my vectors on the farm for faster results. I can then simply read these renders back in and plug them into one of the other nodes in the Smart Vector toolset, such as the Vector Distort. Now I want to highlight that these two nodes being connected like this, well, technically they're separate, but this being rendered and then connected into the Vector Distort is the same as just taking this Smart Vector pipe and plug it into the Smart Vector node itself. You'll get the same output at the end of the script. So I'm just going to put them back. So let's now have a look at the Vector Distort node. Now, in the Vector Distort node, you'll see that the first setting is the reference frame. And this is very important because the reference frame is the frame by which all other frames will be warped relative to. So I currently have mine set to the beginning, but you want to choose a frame which is representative of the overall shape that you're going to be warping. So the larger shape, similar to how when you're creating a roto, your first roto, you want to pick the shape which can be morphed the best. So in this case I've used 4145 because the shot overall doesn't change that much, so it's really simple to pick any frame here. I then also have my frame distance value, and the frame distance value is very important because for every single shot you work on there's going to be an optimum value for the frame distance. Now, a low value of 0 or 1 is great for really fast shots, so fast motion shots with maybe a short frame range, whereas higher frame values such as 5 to 6 is much better for longer shots with low motion. Now, in changing this value, you're essentially having a trade-off between warping things well for nearby frames versus frames further away. So really come in, have a play with this, and find out what's optimal for your script. We have a few other settings we'll look at later in further examples, but for now this is the Vector Distort node, and what it's doing is it's taking our element input and it's going to push these values. So when I start going frame by frame, it will just start moving that around based on the motion vectors we've generated from our Smart Vector. So coming on down, we then do a simple grade and other elements, but all we then do is merge back over the original source footage. So once I merge over, we now have our element on top of our main character, and if I start playing, you can see that it's moving with the cheeks. So this is a really quick, easy, simple setup. And the nice thing is, if I want to test out something other than this element I've created, I can come in and say connect it to this other element here. So if I just grab the target, plug it in, I now have a horrible looking mole, and if I play that, that's moving along because of the vectors as well. So this is a really great way to test out and experiment what different elements will work well for your shot. So now let's jump back to our slides. So now that we've looked at a basic use case, I want to go through some of the guidelines we've looked at there for just generally getting started. So for your best initial results, it's good to not have a shot which has deformations that vary drastically over long periods of time. You can push results further as you start learning the tool more extensively and even extend the frame range you work on. There's even use cases for more explosive movements, and I'll demo that actually in the next example. For the best smart vectors, use vector detail set to 1, but a lower value such as 0.3 is great for initial testing and even be completely viable on most of your shots. If you set the reference frame to a frame where the focus object shows the most of its common shape, similar to selecting your first roto shape, then that will really help and give you the maximum lifespan for your vector distort. You should also set the frame range on the vector distort node for only the frames you want to use. This prevents unnecessary warping outside the range you're working with. Also adjust the frame distance knob. This is very important as it will really make sure you get the most out of your smart vectors, as every single shot has its own distance knob value that's perfect for it. So we're just going to jump across now to another shot that we can give a simple example of. In this instance, we're going to be working on this ballerina shot, and what I'd like to do is just set my in and out point so we can have a quick view. That's the end of the shot at the end. So what we'll be doing here is we'll be taking this element of this dancer as she jumps across and leaps, and you can see we're going to put an element right here on top of the dress which has a lot of flowing movement, a broad range of changes. We have this big sweeping flap coming in and even shadows to deal with. So once we have this element, we're going to generate our smart vectors and we're going to turn them from that into this. So now we get all of this great pattern work, and if I play it for you, you can see how how that's deforming with the rest of the dress and how it's spreading really well. So with that being said, let's jump across and look at the script. Now the script itself is not too dissimilar from the one we've already looked at. It's pretty much a read as we had before, coming into a smart vector down here where we're generating our smart vectors. Here we're actually using a vector detail of 0.3. So even with an explosive movement, you can see in this shot, we can still use a lower vector detail. And if we needed to, we can push this up to help extend our use of smart vectors if need be. I'm also doing my export to write and then reading it back in. But one thing that you may notice is I have a grade above my smart vectors. And this is because smart vectors, similar to how when you want to create camera trackers, you can improve the image in order to make the smart vectors better. So when I want to create a track, for instance, I will usually try to increase the contrast so that there's more data for the tracker to pick on. Well, with smart vectors, we want to increase the light in the shot. So we want to make it the best lit shot as possible. So it shouldn't have loads of darks where there's lots of data and pixel data being lost, or lots of highs where there's too many bright spots. So you want to come in and grade or color correct to bring this image down so that just subtle changes, even such as this, will help generate the best vectors possible. Once I've generated my vectors, that's coming out, and I'm plugging that into my vector distort node, and I'm also plugging in the element I wish to work with. So that's just this simple pattern here. If I just play that through, you can see how it extends nicely coming out, and we've got lots of these nice smooth curves coming through. So once that's applied with my vector distort, it's moving now with the woman as she dances. And just to make clear again, if I look at our smart vector layer here, and I make sure that I'm actually looking at our smart vectors there so that we can generate the correct movement, you can see down here we have all the dancers underneath, and this green patch is the dancer who's extending above. So it's a bit abstract, but you do get a feeling of the shot if you pay close enough attention. So I'm just going to switch that back, and we'll view our original footage. Now, I'm also using one of the vector to motion nodes, and this is so that I can get the motion data out, and I'm later plugging it in my vector blur and using that motion channel. And this is simply creating some nice blurring to drive highlights and sparkles that are being added to the dress. So let's see if I can quickly highlight that for you. So just these little elements here, which as it grows will change and shift. But other than that, it's just creating some keys and then doing the same merge operation as before. And once we merge it over the top, you get this great result. So I'm just going to select a few frames. In fact, I don't even need to do that. We have our result here, and we can play through and see how nice the shot is working. Though one thing that I wanted to highlight is that with fine details like this patchwork we have here, the further the shot goes on and the more we distort it, the more we get jagged lines of things. And I actually think in this script I may have already fixed this using our vector distort toolset. Indeed I have. I've updated our blur size, and if I put this back to 0, which is what it would be by default, you can see how jagged these lines have become. They used to be smooth and really curved. Well, with the vector distort node, if ever you encounter this problem, and it happens especially with fine details, we have the blur slider, which you can increase to help smooth out those issues. And this is a really simple and quick way to fix this problem. Then the reason it works and how it works is we're essentially blurring the internal ST map, and by doing so helping to smooth out that motion. This is also completely keyable, so you can go in and set a key and animate it across the shot, which is, really great for fine-tuning how you want your smart vectors to operate and how you want them to distort. So with that being said, we can have a look back at our final shot. Here we go. And see how well with this larger movement we have such a nice distortion, and using that nice blur to ensure that the lines stay nice and curved and consistent. In fact, I'll just increase that for you a little bit so it looks a little bit better. Great, so let's jump back into our slides. So now that we've looked at our two basic examples, let's have a quick overview of the tips and tricks. Some of those we touched on, some we haven't. So one thing we didn't touch on is longer shots. Obviously, smart vectors with the reference frame, the further you get away, then the harder it is to get an accurate distort. So you can actually combat this for longer shots by using multiple vector distort nodes and blending between them. So you can use the same smart vectors that you've generated, then create multiple vector distorts, set the reference frame to different ones, and then have a nice blend either using a merge, a dissolve, whatever works best for you. You can even get away with switch nodes that I'll show you later. And this is a great way to keep using smart vectors for as long as you feel like you can blend in a nice way that users won't notice. Another thing you can do is you can set a mask alpha channel for the region you want to warp. Depending on the motion, this will help sometimes more than others, but it can be really useful if you want to remove some background objects that are pushing in on your focus object and creating some unwanted motion vectors. If you simply mask it by rotating it out, then you can remove that data when you generate your smart vectors. To maximize the quality of your vectors, you want to grade or color correct the plate as we just discussed. So you want to remove the zero blacks and normalize the luminance spikes. This is creating more pixel data for the smart vectors to work with. Again, the blur slider, something we introduced in Nuke 11, will really help with that line consistency during warping and for fine details. Another nice thing is that if you ensure your smart vectors on a really fast drive or network connection, then this will help just with your day-to-day and reviewing them, because in and output is the largest factor in the total processing time. So the next thing I want to talk about are the common issues you can face when using smart vectors. Micro distortions is something we just looked at and something that I think is quite common. You also have foreground objects, including the focus object, which causes the pushing and pulling of vectors away. And this one's a very tricky thing to deal with, but something we'll have a quick look at in our production example. Background objects similarly pushing and pulling vectors away from the focus object can also be a problem, but this is usually a lot of a simpler fix because we can simply rotoscope the background objects away so that we just have black and no motion in the background, and then there won't be anything to push or pull those vectors because there won't be motion vectors generated if you create your smart vectors from this rotoed plate. So another thing that can occur are lighting changes in a shot. So you may have a shadow that comes across or a bright sunbeam that comes across. And because we're just analyzing the image information, that will just be seen as a motion change and therefore create the pushing pulling effect. So this is another thing that we want to address later, and I'll show you in a different production example script. So we also have large rotational movements. This, for instance, is say I want to put a scar or a blood effect on my arm, but I want it to be on the forearm or the back of my hand, sorry. But then I rotate my hand so that the palm is facing you instead of the back of my hand. In doing so, my hand changes shape quite drastically and gets beyond the field of view that you would normally see. So to combat this, we can use the multiple vector distorts and blend between, but another way is to combine techniques. So you can use your spline warps and grid warps here alongside your smart vectors and get the best results possible by combining all your toolkit. So now that we've had a discussion about the general tips and tricks, and also some issues you might encounter, I think it'd be great to jump into one of our production examples. Now the first one I want to show you is Victor Perez's short film Echo. This is a really great film that I've had the pleasure to watch at a pre-screening event, and it's really exciting to be able to get to use this and look inside the script itself. So thank you so much to Victor Perez, who was kind enough to share one of his production shots, which heavily utilized the smart vectors. The short film is currently being screened in selected film festivals worldwide, and it'll be available next summer online. But please do go check out the making of documentary available at echoshortfilm.com. It's really good, showcases a lot of the work that went on, as well as some really great technological insights as to the camera tricks that we use. Some quite advanced stuff going on. There's also the trailer available, which showcases the shot that we're going to be working on today. Now, unfortunately, because there is partial nudity in the shot, we've had to crop this out for demonstrative purposes. So we're really underselling the shot in a lot of ways. So check out the trailer to make sure you really understand the quality of the production values here. Another notice that the script is one of the older scripts, so it's not up to the standard of the final production, but it still has all the techniques, all the really useful information that we were keen to demonstrate to you. So with that, let's jump into it. So I'm just going to jump back into our sequence, and here we have the shot. So I'm just going to full screen this and we're going to play through, and we have this little blood effect on the screen right now that's been added in using our smart vectors, as well as this blood trail coming down. we've got the blood on the fingers, which were actually done using spline warps. So we'll explain why spline warps were used in that instance and perhaps not smart vectors, or what you could have done with smart vectors. Because both techniques are always viable in a lot of these cases. It's just always choosing what's right and what's most efficient at the time. That smearing on the bed is done both using smart vectors and spline warps again, and also the blood on the hammer. So some really nice use cases that we can dive into. So let's open the script. As always, we don't need to save the past versions. We just want to get in and get stuck in. So this is a production quality script that we're going to be opening. It's a lot larger than the previous scripts, hence why it's taking its time now. And what this is able to showcase to you is how, even though the script is much larger and therefore more complex, it's still falling back on a lot of the same techniques and the same structures that we've been looking at already. And it's just always a case of structuring well. Fortunately for us, Victor is a master at keeping scripts well organized and just in a great state. So I'm just going to come in, view the top of our node graph. So if I zoom back out, we have here essentially two sections. This right-hand section is all the spline warp work and everything that's being done with rotoscopes and spline warps. And this left section is all the work being done with smart vectors. So what I really love about this script is, even though smart vectors allow you to achieve so much, it's about using them in conjunction with all the other techniques and you have really extensively built your knowledge on over the years to help you achieve the best results you can as fast as possible. So a quick look at what's going on for the spline warps. Here we have the hand, and it's over frames 2635 to 2872. So if I just jump across, and we'll try and have a quick look. Now, apologies, the script's running a little bit slow because it's 4K and my machine is just not quite up to the task at the moment. But it's a really great example because here is where we're going to add the blood to the fingers. So if I come down and I view our example here, you can see we've added these little blood elements to the fingers, and this has all been done by spline warps. The reason it's been done by spline warps is if I go back to our sequence and you watch that through, it's this rotational movement of the hand to begin with. Doing that with smart vectors to begin with would have been a lot more work than just spline warping it. However, this end part here, where the hand's fairly in the same position and everything, smart vectors could have been a great use case also. The thing is, there's not really a lot of deformations, like the folds on the fabric and the that kind of subtle billowing is really where smart vectors comes to its own. But this is giving you a good insight as to why you might choose one of the other methods over utilizing smart vectors. Now, if I come across, you can see something very familiar, which is we're generating from our source here, our smart vectors, and currently we're setting our frame range, vector detail 1, of course, because we want to make sure our vectors are as strong as possible, and we're rendering them out to EXR. Now, something that Victor does a little bit different, and excuse me for zooming out so much, I just keep accidentally middle clicking with my mouse. He's plugging the smart vectors into his vector distort, as we have all been doing in our previous examples, setting the correct reference frame for what he thinks is the most relevant. So let's jump back to 2620, I believed it was. And from there, he's also deciding his frame distance, so he's choosing 1 for instance. But one thing that's very different is the output. It has previously always been set to warped source, which allows us to just directly push from the vector distort node itself and merge that back over the plate. But in this instance, he's outputting an ST map from his vector distort node, and in doing so, he can then plug that into his ST map node and drive everything through here. So what is he driving? Well, he's got himself a roto that he's created, and he's then graded that roto to be red. You can still see if I switch over to the alpha, but it's a lot darker there, so I'll just bump that up so you can briefly see. We're then doing an eye distort just to create some more blood-like look to it. And what's really interesting here is using the use of corner pin 2Ds and a transform to move the element into the correct space. So we're just going to put that into space. Actually, we'll keep that bumped up a little bit until we switch across to the merge. And then we're doing all the little blurs and everything like that. all of that gets piped down, and it's actually being piped into a switch node at the moment, something which I'm keen to explore with you later, because this is one of the techniques we talked about in switching between multiple vector distort nodes with different reference frames set. So if I come in and view the final result here, bump that back down. We don't have any rotoscoping going on the hands. That happens further down in the script. But here you get a great instance of this is the end point of the vector distort. So we've already gone through and had this distort quite a lot. And if I come in, you can see the end point of when our final vector distort manipulation happens and when we switch over to the next one. So switching between these two, you can clearly see the difference of having something that has a reference frame much earlier. In fact, I might just set my region here so we can have a faster showcase of that. So this really showcases the difference between having something that happens earlier and a reference frame which happens very close to the act that you're doing. And here, all the top level is in a better place, whereas earlier this is all being pushed down thanks to the finger movement. The motion vectors of the hand coming down is warping it in kind of an unwanted way, but we're hiding a lot of that through the rotor of the hand, and also this fold of the clothing is going to rotor us over the top. So a lot of times you'll find with smart vectors you may get very unwanted warping results when you're having that overlapping we talked about as one of the common problems. But in a lot of instances, you can use the shot around you and find really good overlapping points of other elements to hide the transitional periods and get yourself onto a new vector distort, warping a new reference frame. And then by doing so, you essentially reset the quality of the smart vectors in essence, and are now able to start afresh with some really good detail in that. And this is all again going to be rotoscoped. Now, this continues to happen later on when we have a switch further down. I don't know if that'll be able to show that just because it's off screen. So we're going to remove our thing. There we go. So it does happen again. And if we just switch there, a very small shift, but you can see it widens out. But you won't notice that in the production because it just looks like the shirt's billowing. So again, a very clever transition just using switch nodes. In a future instance, we're going to show you how to do the exact same thing, but with a merge. And with the merge, you can key the mix so that as you decrease the mix of one merge, which is, the one vector distort that's being referenced, you then increase the key mix of another one across the same frame range. So you blend between the two much nicer. So that can help where you don't have these folds and these little places to hide these changes in. So a mixture of techniques will definitely help. So having looked at this, I also wanted to showcase one other point about what Victor's doing, and that is referencing back to using these transform nodes. So what frame were we on? We're on currently, yes, we're using our middle switch segment because we're in the middle of the frame ranges, and I just wanted to go in and disable a few nodes and show everything with a checkerboard. I think it's a really good technique to come in and get a better understanding of what's going on if you just replace everything with a checkerboard, and then you can see what's being pushed, what's not being pushed, things like that. So that's close to the end of our frame range. If I go back to the earlier stages, you can clearly see smooth checkerboard, a little bit of warping down here, but as we go across, the checkerboard is starting to be affected by the hand. It's pulling out and it's causing this distortion to really, not work well for us. Fortunately, in this instance, we know this is our blood shape and it's not being pulled as much. Like the pull is happening on this corner. So we're able to get away with this slight distortion. The trouble is, this distortion is actually worse than it's looking right here. The reason being, we did our corner pin to get it into our place, and that got us, most of the way there. But if I disable this transform, you can clearly see how much the distortion has pushed us across. And that's where Victor's being really smart, because he's taken his corner pin, and then he's got his transform to bring it back into the location he really needs it to be. So you can utilize other nodes to rearrange and replace. It doesn't have to be a corner pin, it doesn't have to be a transform, it can be your grid warps, it can be your spline warps, and you can combine techniques in order to get that motion vector detail, so capture these folds as they billow in the smart vector data, but then when it gets pulled away by the motion vectors of other unwanted elements, use your other techniques, your other parts of your toolkit to bring it back, put it into place, and even get a little bit manual if you want to adjust the rolls, adjust the effect and make it a bit more creative, and really direct what you want to happen. So I just thought I would highlight this because I think it's a great example of what people sometimes overlook when working with smart vectors, is the fact that it doesn't just stop at creating the vectors and it either works or it doesn't. And you can still add manipulations and keep going to make something really powerful and effective. So the other part of this shot that I just wanted to quickly highlight is the bloodbed smear. So we're using very similar techniques. We have both the corner pin and the transform, but what it's doing is, if I've just undisable that, is we're having this really interesting part where on frames 3054 and 3055, if I just jump across, whereby we're using the transform again to place our elements exactly where we need. I mean, it's literally just animated, as you can see by the little a on this transform here. We're just animating that translate on these two values. So if I disable this, you can see with the smart vectors by default, it's actually lagging behind a little bit. The movement of the hand has pushed it away from its default, from the space we wanted it to exist in. And then if I switch back to an earlier frame, you can see that transition. It's staying, but it's not smearing with. So by using the transform, we're simply bumping up and bringing it back into place. So I think that's a really great way to, again, use the other tool sets to improve the great detail you're getting from the smart vectors for these wrinkles and for these cloth values. And then the blood print of the hand that will appear underneath is literally just not using smart vectors, it's just using a stencil and corner pin technique. So combine the elements for what's most applicable. So this has been Victor Perez's short film shot F from Echo, and it's been a really nice one to explore and investigate. Now we're going to jump back into our sequence to our next example, and this one's a really great one for showcasing the lighting changes and how you can address them in your shots. So if I just full screen this and give it a quick playthrough, you'll see that we're going to do some cleanup. We're going to do a tattoo removal on this actress's back, but notice as she walks through the shot, we have lighting changes. We're going from this darker space, this dark here, into a lighter value, into the skin's clearly visible then, and then again the turn is causing this shadowing effect, but you can still see the tattoo even in that base. So in order to address this, I'll showcase our eventual result. Oh, and also I just wanted to thank the guys at FXPhD, because they were kind enough to share this shot with us, and a lot of the work that they put into this. So credit where credit is due. But as we go through here, you can see there's no visible tattoo anymore. I'm just going to frame key by key so we can look at the paint job, because essentially what's happened is they've taken still frames on different areas of the shot, so at different lighting transitions, and they've vector distorted each of those still frames where they create a clean plate by removing the tattoo, and then they've merged between each of those as the appropriate light change happens. So a really nice job for cleanup there. So let's jump into the script and have a look. Great. So this one's a little bit different for the starting setup. We have our footage itself with its tattoo. Then we're coming down and we're generating our vectors here. We've even got a nice little time estimate for those 0.3 vector detail. Kind of meaningless without the machine, but it's not too shabby. And we're also using the color correct to lift the shadows and give ourselves better smart vector results. So again, these dark areas, this pixel information in here that we can get out that will really help with the smart vectors, especially seeing as we're focusing on addressing shadow areas in this shot. Now the next part is generating our clean plates for each of the frames. So if I jump over to frame 44, you can see we're using rotor paints here to select the certain area, feather it around, select the entire area, and then we're cleaning that up using some nice expression work there to blend it all together. We're cleaning this up, and we've got rid of the tattoo on that single frame. But if I start jumping forward, that paint job still exists in the same form. It's just for a single frame, and therefore what we want to do is go to another frame where the lighting change is quite large. This one's 87. You see this is from our frame 44 clean plate. Now if I view this frame, we've done our cleanup here, and the same will be true for frame 111. So let me just view that to showcase the clean plate paint job. So once these have been created and rendered, so that we now have 3 frames at various positions in the frame range, we can come down to our vector distort. And here we're taking our smart vector render that we've done, and that's connecting to the other vector distorts lower down. We're taking that render, we're putting it into our vector distort node. We're taking our first clean plate on frame 44, and we're plugging that in. So now we're distorting this clean plate by the motion vectors, and that's going to push that clean plate. Rather than have, as before, it just stay stationary and not do anything, we're going to be able to go through the shot and see. In fact, I'll jump down to here. We're going to go through the shot, and you'll be able to see that it stays in place, and there's no visibility of the tattoo appearing. Now this will only last and be successful for as long as that clean plate has a similar use case of the back. But this is why we created multiple clean plates, because as she turns her back and the lighting changes happen, we're going to need to blend into our other clean plates. So the way we're doing that is, after we've created our first clean plate, we're merging that in, and we're using our roto here to just mask that area where the tattoo is happening. So if I was to not look at the roto or not view the roto, and we jumped ahead a bunch of frames, then the rest of her body would be manipulated by it, but we just want to focus in this singular area. So once we've done that for the early thing, we want to start animating our merges. So if I open up this merge here, you can see it comes into effect. The mix is 0 on frame 15. Then we have the mix coming up to 20 onto 1 at frame 22. So here we're saying let's go from just the background footage to having this new clean plate footage take over and do the paint job for us. And same again later on, we have our mix value to 1, and then as she turns, when we want to do something else, we're changing on frame 111 to have the mix value to be 0. The tattoo is visible because we're currently higher up the tree, but if we come down, we're going to skip the middle one and go to the bottom where we generated our clean plate for that frame and view that merge. As soon as we view this is going to showcase the clean plating technique, because if I remove the first merge to make it completely clear, on frame 93, the vector distort that we're doing for the clean plate on frame 111 has a mix of 0, and then we're blending it up to 1 on frame 111. So we're switching from our first clean plate to our third clean plate, and in between both of those we're obviously switching to our middle clean plate. So this is a fantastic technique to get around these tricky situations whereby the motion vectors can be distorted or pushed when you're analyzing them. And you can use the clean plating technique to just get a single frame, isolate it, and then use that instead. So I really recommend looking into this workflow in the merging. It's a great way for you to really build upon your knowledge and extend your use cases for smart vectors. So with that, let's jump back into our slides. So now that we've had a look at a couple of basic examples and some production examples, I want to jump across to experimenting with smart vectors. The great thing about our community and our users is you always see really imaginative imaginative and creative effects going on. Part of the inspiration for this part was a user by the handle Hellfish, HELLPHISH, on Reddit created a fantastic effect using smart vectors, whereby he had the Dark Knight footage and he was using the motions of the vectors to create edge distorts and create this really good white line with bright colors outside, and it would just warp really interestingly. Words can't describe it. Please do go check it out on Reddit. I think it's worthwhile your time to see what people are getting up to. And it kind of inspired me to have a play myself. Now, I don't think my effect is anywhere as cool as our users, but it was really interesting to come in and have a quick play and showcase, not showcase, but see what I could achieve using smart vector data to drive an effect. So what I have here is I was envisioning sort of like a radial effect coming out from the butterflies. It's sensing movement, it's sonar, that kind of thing, and having it be driven by the motion of the butterfly wings itself. And also the color change is also being generated by the smart vector data. So I just want to jump in and showcase you a quick example of how you can manipulate the information that's available to you. Again, I kind of want to show this so that users can, if you're not aware of what you can achieve, you can go in and make even better effects than this and really turn it into something much, much cooler. So I have my butterfly footage in here. I'm literally just creating an alpha, and then very similar setup. Create my smart vectors, and in this instance 0.9, just because it was fine. And if you skip this area here and come down, we've got our vector distort as usual. I'm actually setting a frame distance of 2 here because it works best for the length of the shot with the range of motion. And I'm bringing in this constant node over here. This is going to be my source input, but what I'm doing with that constant node is I'm creating an expression. Now currently I've expression linked that expression, so we'll view the original, and it's very simple. It's just an expression that creates a radial ring that grows in size, and that's done purely using this calculation here. I've given myself a center variable and a size variable, which I'm putting onto my user knobs, and I'm doing that, 1, so that I can adjust the position really easily if I choose to, and 2, so that I can manipulate the size as well. In being able to manipulate the size, it's given me this great ability to also link the size to our smart vector data. And the way I'm doing that is I'm shuffling the smart vectors into our RGBA channel, and then I'm using the curve tool for the maximum luminance. So I'm trying to get the maximum luminance, which is representative of the motion with smart vectors, and use that data to generate a curve of data and values that I can put into the size parameter to generate all of that movement. So when I play this is all changing based on the movement of the butterfly, and that movement is being determined by the smart vectors themselves. So we'll just clear that out. I've also added a noise for visual interest just to keep things less bland. So that's one way I was able to use smart vector data to create something new with it, or create a new type of effect with it. And by new, obviously, I just mean for me. The second part of the effect was using the smart vector data and actually inputting this as a mask to a grade. So here, I'm using this grade by masking it using the smart vector directional channels. So I'm using one of the directional channels for each grade, and that's giving me color over certain parts of the shot. So if I jump back here, disable the second node, you can see we're adding that little bit of green hit and that blue hit, and then if I come here, you can see we're adding more. So I've created color that's just being generated by the smart vector data and is changing over the top. It's a very, I guess, psychedelic effect when you combine it with the rings in some senses, but I'm gonna bring that down, tone it down a bit so that it becomes more of just a bit more subtle. So that's the expression being vector distorted, and then with the two with each other pre-molted to create the end effect that we're then going to grade, just give it some color and merge over the top. And that's essentially what I was playing around with, just trying to access the smart vector data again in unusual ways and see how that could be used to create something interesting. On this side, we've done pretty much the same thing. It's more about just creating the backdrop, and we're adding a few of the concentric circles to the backdrop just as a subtle back effect. And in doing that, we have our final result. Now, I'm not going to lie, the reason I showed you this first is because we also have some examples to show you from our Nuke Studio or Nuke competition for smart vectors. This is a competition we ran last year, and it was fantastic to see the work that users put into it. I've selected the top 3 on the list. So we have Pranjal Chowdhury, Delina Godia, Ali Etamami. I'm going to showcase their work as it's some really interesting stuff. But that's not to say that the rest of the entrants there, Adam Thompson, Maduka Gunasekara, Ryan Tripenti, these are our winners and runners-up. But alongside these people and the rest of the entrants who you can check out on our community, some amazing work, and everyone deserves to be highlighted. But there's little time. So with that being said, let's jump across and showcase what our users are really getting to grips with some great cases of smart vectors. So let's just remove our in and out points. And we're going to actually jump back to this shot afterwards. So here we have Danila, then we're going to go on to Ali, and finally Pranjal. And the first effect goes quite quickly, but it's a really nice sort of ghost in the effect style shot. And this one's a longer shot, so it's really impressive to have the smart vectors generate over such a long time with such fast movements, but getting all that vein detail creeping up and across the body, and even this matrix style lip extend is really cool. And this shot was just beautifully done. It felt really natural, but what was really impressive is there's a lot of range of movement going on. That rotation is still sticking really well, so very good technical detail, especially at the end there. So that's some of the examples of some of our what can be achieved by some hobbyists and professionals alike, creating some really beautiful effects, and experimenting with smart vectors can do. Now, you saw briefly another shot that I mentioned we get to, so we're just going to jump across to that now. And the reason I'm saving this one a little bit later is it's an experimental effect, or it's an experimental technique to use with smart vectors, but it's one that is contributing to a use case scenario that we encounter every day as visual effects artists and compositors, and that is tracking. We'll often get shots which are extremely difficult to track. They don't have high contrast, they don't come with tracking markers, and it can be a real nightmare. This shot itself is not. It's got clear tracking markers, it's very simple camera movement, it's got high contrast, it's everything that you want for tracking in a lot of ways. But I want to explore how you can use smart vectors to help improve poor quality tracks, and in choosing this shot, it also allows me to showcase how you can use smart vectors to do a little bit of cleanup. So 2 wins. We're going to jump in now to look at the script and what's going on and what you need to do in order to get this kind of technique working for you. It's really simple again to set up. We have our footage. It's the same as before. You're getting bored of me saying it, but it's really quick and easy to build this. And all we're doing is we're taking our footage, we're creating a roto paint, like cloning across to paint out those original markers, so those red ones up there, and we're using our vector distort to push that paint job across. So I haven't need to create any camera tracking data or anything at this point. I'm literally just reusing smart vectors that I may have created earlier in the script. And it's a nice quick way to get the same job done. If you have that data there, use it. This is a completely viable way to get to a similar result, and often much quicker. Now, in doing that, let's pretend that this shot is now extremely difficult to track. And if it's extremely difficult to track, it's because it doesn't have markers or it doesn't have contrast. So what I wanted to do was add in my own markers now. With those motion vectors, I am able to add, my own markers to the scene and have them move with the shot using the same motion vectors. And this is really great because in doing so, I'm able to then track these markers and help inform my camera tracker, import like the tracks I made, average them out, import them into a camera tracker, and give myself an edge in maybe getting that track on a really difficult shot. Now, I would say that if you're going to try this technique, there's a few things to note. If you're going to create the markers, one, I recommend creating them on different depth levels. So here I've only done 2, but I would break it down into, as many grounds as there are. So foreground, mid-ground, background. If you have more than that, break it into each, and each roto paint and each vector distort for each level. And I would also say that when placing the markers, you want to place them on objects which are facing towards the camera, so they're not on a weird angle like a wall that's tilted, because then when there's moving, the distortion will be much greater. And you only want to camera track any of the distorts that over a period of time have maintained extremely well. If the distorts are starting to go a weird shape, then that's obviously going to affect how the final solve for the track is. So only pick the ones that work perfectly well for you. I personally split out each of them not only into their own foreground, background, midground, but also sometimes into their own vector sorts for each roto shape. That way I can have roto paint. So that way I can have complete control by plugging them into their own vectors distort. I can really tailor the vectors distort settings, so the reference frame, the frame distance, the blur, everything like that to that specific shape, and that will give me the best chance of getting high quality solves. Now, once I've created all of them, I do the same technique of merging them over the shot. I would typically then actually render out the shot just to make it a little bit quicker for myself. I wouldn't use this one for instance. This one has not blurred well and looks not great, but the others are working really well. So I'll take them, I'll track them. So let me just select, I'll track them, and then I'll bring those into my camera tracker and then my user tracks, and I'll use that to help solve the tracks on this shot. So I just wanted to highlight how this can be a great way to really come in and use smart vectors to solve a problem that you deal with all the time that you may not have thought of. So a really nice use case. Now, we've had a chance to now look at basic examples, production examples, some experimental examples, and with that, I think it's time to look at what's coming up next for smart vectors. And for us, we're currently looking at smart vectors and looking at a few things. We're looking at speeding up the vector calculation, and this can currently be tested on our alpha. So if anyone's interested, do contact us and let us know. We're also looking at adding a mask input, so more for that roto kind of work that we were talking about earlier. Investigating user correction of vectors, so even aside from the roto stuff, going in and manually manipulating the vectors yourself to give you the results you want. And improving the quality to allow propagation through more frames, so smart vector quality will extend for longer. Now, these are all the things that we're obviously looking at based on what we feel could be useful, but most importantly, what comes next for smart vectors comes from you. So please do let us know your feedback. Let us know what you like about them, what you don't like about them, what you'd really like to see next as a feature or improvements. And the best way to do so is at our support portal. You can find out at foundry.com under the support tab. Go in there, send us any bugs, any features, anything that you want to make us aware of, and that's the best way for us to ensure we can look at it for you. So with all that said, we've gone through a lot already. I hope at the end of this webinar, you're able to look at smart vectors, and for new users, you're able to understand how to generate them. Once you understand how to generate them, how that you can extend their life by the tips and tricks and improving them. And then even how on a production example, you might be able to, keep working and blend them with current techniques. And I hope for more experienced users also, there's at least a few things there that you hadn't thought of before, or will help you to go back and try smart vectors to keep extending them, and keep experimenting. Let us know what you can come up with and what other techniques you generate. If anyone has any questions, please let me know and I'd be happy to answer them. Thanks.